Hello, everyone. Welcome to LA Roundtable, where we dive head-on into the important issues that affect all of us who live and work here in Southern California. I'm Dave Bryan, host of the Roundtable on LA City View 35 and political reporter at CBS 2 and KCAL 9 TV. On this edition of the Roundtable, we're picking up the pieces. That is, the rubble that's left of our dysfunctional state government here in California. This year's budget-busting, deficit-riddled fiasco in the state capitol was the most recent episode in a steep and rapid decline in the governance of our state. The gridlock in Sacramento has crippled the delivery of state services, the effective management of the state's resources, and the ability of the state to pay its employees and its bills on time. The once great golden state of California has been described as becoming a fifth-rate banana republic, and we are all the losers. So how do we get out of this mess and then ensure that it doesn't happen again? Do we need to rewrite the state constitution and start all over again? On today's LA Roundtable, we'll debate some of the specific medications that are being prescribed to cure this very ill patient, including killing some sacred cows. Joining me is a well-connected panel of experts. Dan Schnurr, director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics at USC. Dan was communications director for former Governor Pete Wilson and for the presidential campaign of Senator John McCain in 2000. Stephen Ochoa, vice president of public policy and research for the William C. Velazquez Institute and a representative of RepairCalifornia.org, the group spearheading the move to rewrite the California Constitution. Daniel J.B. Mitchell, professor emeritus at the Anderson Graduate School of Management and the School of Public Affairs at UCLA. He's been considered an expert on the California state budget for many years. Mike Spence, a conservative Republican consultant and strategist who's former chair of the California Republican Assembly. Okay, so first off, we have to clarify, is there a structural problem here that needs to be addressed, or is this just a particularly nasty year of politics in Sacramento? Stephen, you go first.
There are absolutely structural problems, Dave, and thank you for having me. The structural problems have just stemmed from decades of half measures, reforms that have pretty much left California in a place where it really cannot fix itself anymore. Term limits, safe redistricting, the two-thirds budget, they have really just contributed to the gridlock in a way that our elected leaders just cannot address things, and without even if they, giving them the benefit of the doubt and saying they're all trying to do the right thing, sometimes they just can't because of the rules of the game, and it has really left California in some dire straits.
Professor Mitchell, from your perspective as a budget expert, are there things that need to be changed in the way we're budgeting in state government?
Well, I think, yes, there certainly are important changes that could be made, and what you have to recognize is that we don't just have one budget crisis. We've had a whole sequence of them. Duke Majan had a budget crisis in the early 80s. Pete Wilson had one in the early 90s. Gray Davis had one in the early 2000s. Now we're in the next one. So these things keep repeating, and since they keep repeating, that tells you that we need some kind of change in our institutions so that we're better able to deal with the ups and downs of the economy.
Dan Schnurr, you've been on the inside of a gubernatorial administration. From where you stand and from your experience, how do you see the answer to this question?
I think there's a couple of answers. There is a structural crisis, and both Steve and Daniel and the rest of us all agree that there are various possible remedies to be employed. But I think also, at the risk of sounding a little bit ethereal, there's a leadership crisis also. Politics sometimes is about doing something that is unpopular in the short run in order to do what's right in the long run. And one thing we learned in last month's special election, we learned that voters don't like tax increases. We learned that voters don't like spending cuts. So the ultimate lesson we learned is there's no politically popular or even politically palatable way to balance a budget with a $24.5 billion budget deficit. That said, there are structural reforms that can be made to encourage that leadership by that definition. One that Steve mentioned briefly is the redistricting reform that the voters of California did pass last fall. I think by encouraging more competitive elections, you encourage a situation where, at least in some districts, you have members who are more responsive to the needs of their legislators, the needs of their constituents. That doesn't necessarily guarantee leadership, But what it does guarantee is a greater effort on the part of some of the members to work with their constituents, to listen to them, and to work cooperatively across party lines. So some of it's structure, but some of it's just a personal willingness to sacrifice maybe even your own political career in order to serve the goals for which you were elected.
Before we go on to Mike, I want to ask you, I mean, you were involved in the Wilson administration. There were times where the budget, well, I would say, you know, many times where the budget was past its deadline and things were sort of at loggerheads, but it always got worked out. We never got to the kind of dire position where we're going to run out of cash in the next week or 10 days. Why was Pete Wilson able to do it, but yet the current administration is not?
Well, as a former employee of the former governors, I'm obviously an admirer of his, and but I didn't come here simply to sing his praises. But I will say this: number one, he was willing, and I watched him weigh the equation. He was willing to do things that he knew would harm him politically in the short run in order to do what he believed would help the state of California in the long term. And I think more importantly, he was not alone in that. There were legislators of both parties. Because they were elected, because there were more competitive districts in California, you did not have a legislature that, as is the case today, that is made up of only the most intense liberals and only the most intense conservatives. And I do not for a minute intend to say anything pejorative about liberals or conservatives. They are no better or no worse than moderates. But if ultimately two parties are going to come together to fashion a workable solution, if you have a governor standing all by him or herself on the 50-yard line and two-party caucuses residing in their respective end zones, it's a lot more difficult to put together a working coalition than when you do have a more heavily populated center in the legislature.
Mike, I want to ask you, as a conservative Republican leader, it occurs to me that in some respects, and I'm not talking about the immediate crisis of the moment, but looking at it big picture, there doesn't seem to be a lot of anger and passion about revising the Constitution and changing the structure of government and the way we do things among conservatives. Am I wrong about that? Or
no, you're right about that, and that's because these calls for a constitutional convention are really targeted at specific protections, the last protections that taxpayers have in California. There are definitely problems in California, redistricting one of them, and that's why the California Republican Assembly and other conservatives did support redistricting reform when it was on the ballot, because we view that as a problem as well. But the result of what we have now is a result of a legislature and a governor, starting with Gray Davis, that are very liberal. And it's not like conservatives and people that are fiscally conservative have not said you can't keep borrowing, you can't keep spending, you can't keep creating new programs. All the money trees are going to be gone at some point. And the state has really run anyone that had a money tree out of the state. Nevada, Arizona, Kansas has an operation to steal businesses from California. And that's the real problem, is that the policies being enacted, the lack of leadership in Sacramento is what's causing the problems we're facing now. It's not the structure.
I mean, in some respects, it occurs to me that shrinking government, having government do less, do it more efficiently at a lower cost, that's kind of what you guys are all about, right?
Well, generally, yes. There's a limited role for government. Government shouldn't be doing everything for everybody and providing, taking money from people that are productive and giving it to people who aren't or aren't willing to or whatever. There's a certain limit to the kinds of services we should provide, and there's lots of crises that are out there. But, structural reform is not going to solve the upcoming pension crisis. Structural reform is not going to solve a lot of, why businesses are leaving the state of California. And so, when people say structural reform, what they usually want to get at is Proposition 13. They want to get rid of the 2/3 protections for taxes being raised, and that's what they're really talking about.
Term limits.
Well, and term limits. And term limits is you can have arguments on both sides. We're talking, there's a crisis in New York right now, a fiscal crisis and a political crisis, and Rudy Giuliani wrote a piece in the New York Times talking about term limits.